My name is Margarita, and I'm a migrant. My parents came to the United States after the Nicaragua Civil War, and they seek political asylum. I am now one of the 500,000 migrants that live in Costa Rica in a 4 million population. My colleagues here, classmates, one is a Henry Crown Fellow, one a Liberty Fellow, and one a Catto Fellow. And I would like to speak to you today about a subject that we believe encompasses all the subjects that we have covered in each of the panels. We have talked this weekend, and we will continue to talk today and tomorrow about justice, law, human rights, economics, environment, migration, and the refugee crisis, we believe, represents most of them. Today, Chadia would like to speak to you about the situation in Lebanon. Chadia is a lawyer. She's a managing partner in a law firm in Beirut, and she's the founder of the Middle East Leadership Initiative. Patricia is a Liberty Fellow, a lawyer as well, and she works for a nonprofit that defends immigration victims and allows them to call the police without being afraid of backlash. And Carlo is an economist, works for the European Union, and he has been working in designing the negotiation of the restructuring of the Greek crisis. As we listen to them, I ask you to please listen with your heart and with your head. Listen to the statistics, which are mind-boggling, and also listen to your heart. As we read all our readings this weekend, very often we talk about otherness. And the issue of the refugee crisis and migration really challenges us. Are we really thinking about I and otherness? How big is that distance? How big do we want it? And do we want to bridge it or not? And after, this will not be a panel or a conversation. It is a work that we did this morning. Once they're finished, this lunch panel will be finished and you can go on to your next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita, and thank you all. And of course, I'm humbled at least to speak in your presence. I'm an economist, as Margarita said, so I will talk a bit about numbers and a bit about what's happening in Europe to make a few points. Now, when you talk about migration, it's in perception matters a lot, of course. And the first thing to think about is how many people are actually migrants. Now, according to UN data, in 2015, 3.3% of the global population was living outside its country of birth. It was about, it's more or less 240 million people. Now, many think that there's been an incredible escalation of migration in the past few years. Perception matters a lot, because in 2000, actually, the percentage was 2.8%. So the increase in the past 15 years of the people living outside their country of birth is 0.5%, 70 million people, which are a lot, but it's not as much as one would imagine. Now, when it comes to Europe, I think it's important to separate two issues. One is economic migrants, and one is refugees. Now, what we are seeing in Europe is a combination of both. The most tragic one is, of course, refugees, and the most visible one is refugees. I would like to cite one number specifically, which is 4,579 people, which died at sea in the Mediterranean in 2016 while trying to cross the Mediterranean. In 2017, 2,378 people have died already. So Europe is attracting people at large rates. This is changing the perception of migrants. I would briefly touch upon the situation in my country, which is Italy. Italy attracted in 2016 180,000 migrants by sea, through the Mediterranean. In 2017, we are already at 90,000. Now, to give you a sense, this would be as if in the US, you would have 1 million people landing on your shore in 1 year. So this seems a lot. You will see in a short while when Chadia will talk that this is still very little. Now, one thing is that data on nationality also is a bit counterintuitive. The largest group of migrants to Italy and to the and to Europe comes from Nigeria rather than from other countries that you would imagine. Only 6,000 people came from Syria in 2017, and we'll see why again in a short while. Now, a few words on what Europe is doing about it. There are, I would say, three actions mainly. One is about the contrast of smuggling of people. 90% of migrants resort to smugglers, which are completely careless about their future. They often abandon them at sea, and people die on their boats for this. One important thing is supporting the countries of origin, of course. Europe is investing about 31 billion euro between 2014 and 2020, and is trying to stimulate 44 billion of private investment in Africa to help countries of origin. Then there is a big operation for saving lives, of course, which is what we are doing a lot, especially Italy is taking care of that. And last but not least, I would say we need to review the migration laws to keep Europe an attractive place for migrants. We need migrants because we are facing a demographic crisis. So we cannot afford not to have migrants. I would have three questions for you to think about. One is, to what extent migration is a shared responsibility? We have a big issue in Europe to resettle the migrants across the EU. As I said, we have 180,000 in Italy. There's been an agreement to share these people across the EU. Many member states of the European Union are not accepting these migrants. This is an issue. So should we consider migrants and refugees, of course, as a shared responsibility of European member states or not? And then, of course, one could think about a bigger picture and whether this is or not a global responsibility. The second question is about demographic decline, which I mentioned before. Now, there was an interview 2 or 3 weeks ago of the president of the Italian largest social security fund, who said that essentially, without migrants, the Italian social security system would collapse and would be unable to pay pensions. The question I have is, are we defrauding migrants from their rights? Because these people, let's face it, will stay in Italy for a certain period of time, then maybe they move to another country, or they go back to their countries of origin. They will never get a pension from Italy. So they're paying into a system which will never give anything to them. Is this a fraud? This is another question that we should ask ourselves. And finally, again linked to demographic decline, what we are seeing in Italy due to demographic decline is a change in the composition of classes, especially in primary schools. We are seeing a rise of mixed classes, of course, and there are cases in which the number of foreigners is larger than the number of Italians in those classes. Now, this creates a problem. Let's face it, let's be honest about that. The class sometimes goes slower. What should we do about that? No one thinks about segregating people based on nationality, of course, but we have to recognize that the problem exists, and this creates anxiety for parents. So we should imagine some way of including better these children in their classes. I will stop here. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. It's on? Okay. All right. So I'm just listening to Carlo here talk about the pressure and the efforts that the European community and all the others are doing. And I just want to tell you about pressure and efforts exponential so that you just understand where I'm coming from. I'm from Beirut, Lebanon. We have close to 2.5 million refugees on a population of 4.5 million. This would be the equivalent of 175 million refugees coming into the US. So what does that mean? I mean, so when I think about that, what's the impact of that? When I think about who helps, so who hosts these people, these refugees? Right now, the numbers are close to 25 million around the world. 86% of the people hosting refugees right now are the Middle East, African, so the underdeveloped or the developing countries. And around 12% to 14% is the developed world, which is US, Europe, and Australia, and Latin America, like some of the countries in some of the other countries that are more developed. So these numbers, I find them very striking because Again, the question of the shared responsibility. Is this a collective problem or not, and is it a collective responsibility or not? And for sure it must be. We're not the ones, we have 2.5 million refugees. Lebanon is not at the source of the problems in Palestine. Lebanon is definitely not at the source of the problems in Syria. We didn't create a war there. And then we have a lot of, it's a human thing. We cannot send them back because they will die if we don't let them across into our borders. And then once they're in, they're living in dismal conditions with very bad circumstances. The cost has been evaluated on our country at $4.5 billion a year, US dollars a year, on our country by the Central Bank of Lebanon, 1.5 billion direct and 3.5 billion indirect cost. So just to get an idea of the numbers, that's just economic. Social problems, criminal problems, a lot of crime. So my children, we're very concerned about going out on the streets now. We don't go to malls, we don't go to streets, because the other problem is that 75% of the refugees are outside camps. They don't live in camps. So they're all over the country. They have no hope, and they really have very difficult circumstances. They take 7% of our water consumption in a country where water is a very problematic resource at the source of many wars and many conflicts. They take electricity. They take infrastructure. We have a lot of infrastructure that is being pulled on. So what I wanted to raise as questions is the collective responsibility and the proportionality of this. We need to consider that it has to become an international problem for everyone to resolve, and that countries should be dealing with this proportionally. And the other thing is, what is the hope for these refugees? They come and live in our country. They really don't have much hope, no education. They don't have a future. These are people who are left to be exploited. They will be exploited by people, either for violence, either for sex, either for other reasons. And it is a duty for us to do something about it. I have a sincere concern about this. I just want to leave you with a pledge. I mean, please think about this problem, because it's not just a local problem, and embrace the other, because in the end, that's the real problem. It's distrust. And it's not just distrust of the refugees or by the host countries, but it's really even people like me who are very privileged, who are very lucky to be among, to have an education, to have access. But I am angry, and this anger creates more inequality, a huge gap, and it's a real concern to be considered by really, it's a problem that will lead to problems all over the world. So, thank you.
And I'm going to end our comments with a challenge for all of us to think about the thoughts of complex movement of individuals across international borders is challenging for all of us to get our heads around. But I think what we also want to remind ourselves is that the measure of society and the measure of who we are is how we treat the least of these once they are among us. For this question is very personal for me. My husband and I are just proud parents of a foster child from Guatemala. We began working with her in 2003 when a local family court judge contacted my office and said, we have a young immigrant child from the northern highlands of Guatemala here in Greenville, South Carolina. She was promised a better life here in the United States. Her parents sent her with these people only to find that she was forced into domestic servitude. She was locked in, wasn't allowed to go to school, was forced to cook and clean and serve as the nanny. And if she complained or didn't live up to those standards, she was beaten and degraded. In 2003 in Greenville, South Carolina, she had an idea, and other people in her community who saw what was happening to her said, here in the United States, people have rights. People here in the United States will help me, because coming from Guatemala, she thought police here in the United States will help me. And she believed that, and she asked for help and got out. And the family court system and the social workers and the police officers helped her. And today, she's an incredible woman. She's 27 years old. She speaks Spanish. She speaks English. She speaks her native language, too. She is a wonderful and incredible woman. And when I asked her what I could do to share with you all today, which is most important to her, she really was sad, because she said that if the same thing happened to me today, I would never have called. I would never have called the police, because in the last few years here in the United States, we have seen an increase in deportations that has exponentially increased. More disturbingly, local and state laws have been passed and federal policies have been implemented that tie local law enforcement to immigration enforcement in a very direct and serious way. Local law enforcement in the state of South Carolina is required to inquire as to immigration status. She would never have called, and she says that today she would have still been in that situation. She would continue to have been abused, and the individuals who hurt her would never have been prosecuted and sent to jail. So we are challenging here today to think about the reality of what's happening in Lebanon and in Europe and all around the world as we think about receiving our brothers and sisters who are in crisis. And we also challenge you to think about, once they're here, beyond the collective responsibility that we all have, what can we do here and in our own homes and in our communities to make sure that once we receive people who are fleeing poverty or fleeing violence, that we treat them with the dignity and respect that they deserve while they're here. So we challenge you all to think through that and appreciate your time today.